Hello, my friends across the fruited and rooted plain. It's time for the Gardening Simplified Show with Stacy Hervella, me, Rick Weist, and our engineer and producer, Adriana Robinson. We come to you from beautiful Studio A here at Proven Winners Color Choice Shrubs, and today, well, we're going to talk about something that you've asked us to talk about. Drought. How dry I am. And Stacy, we're not talking about my dry, bad dad jokes. Although I had a good one for you. Here you go. I have the world's worst thesaurus. Not only is it terrible, it's terrible. Do you get that?
I do get that. I don't understand how it ties into drought tolerance, but I get the joke.
It's a dry joke.
Oh, okay.
Let's get to drought tolerance. Remember, plant drought can be triggered by a water deficit in the soil or in the atmosphere, think wind, or both. And Stacy, coming up on today's show in our fourth segment, we'll talk about drip irrigation. This is an issue that people struggle with.
It is. I mean, even when we don't have a drought here in Michigan, which we often have had periods of drought over the last couple of years, you know, living out here near the lakeshore, my soil is just naturally dry. So drought tolerance is a consideration that I, use to pick plants and to maintain my garden all the time because my garden is just naturally dry. It's very sunny. It's very sandy. And so I deal with a lot of that, and it's ready for those challenges, whatever nature throws at it, I hope.
So wherever you live, it's a hot topic. And I know as far as plant breeders are concerned, too, plant breeders are looking at plants that are drought tolerant, especially with the changes in climate that we've been seeing worldwide over the past few years. Now, do some research when you think about drought tolerant plants. In other words, don't assume that native plants are synonymous with drought tolerance. Drought tolerant plants have built-in features or characteristics that make them drought tolerant. And I think, Stacy, right off the bat, we have to say that a lot of drought tolerant plants have reduced leaf surface or maybe even needles that make it a little easier to handle drought.
Definitely. Reducing the leaf surface means fewer stomata. The stomata are the organ of the plant that gives off water vapor when it's photosynthesizing. Fewer stomata means less water vapor given off, and therefore a good adaptation, because that's the main way that plants actually use the water that they're taking up through their roots. Light color foliage is another one.
Sure. And that's why I pitched that to you, because I knew you'd encapsulate that beautifully. Some drought-tolerant plants with large leaves have deep indentations or sinuses between the lobes and the leaves to reduce their leaf area. And another sign of drought tolerance, of course, Stacy, is leaves that have a waxy or a glossy coating. And I think right off the bat, you think about plants like succulents.
Yeah, definitely. Succulents are sort of the ultimate. But there's other adaptations I think that people don't see and maybe don't consider, and that's roots. Drought-tolerant plants tend to have very deep roots that go deep into the soil. They could be a taproot, so they're going way down there and they store a lot of water for the plant to use. And that might be, an adaptation that we don't really see, but is certainly one that helps the plant withstand those challenges.
It's a great point. Or thick, fleshy type roots.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about Baptisia, which is a favorite plant of both yours and mine, or daylilies. They tend to stand up to drought conditions because of those root systems.
Right. And, that's a good point about daylilies, because you have plants that are drought tolerant, and that means the plant will not die if it is in drought. But that doesn't always mean that the plant is going to be at its very best.
Exactly.
Just like you yourself might not be at your best if you're dehydrated. You're still alive, but you're not going to have your biggest, boldest, brightest blooms, all of that kind of stuff. So it's important, I think, that when people understand that a plant is drought tolerant, that they have reasonable expectations about what it's going to do. Now, there certainly are drought tolerant plants out there that will still perform amazingly. Succulents, a great example. In severe drought conditions. But a lot of the plants, especially with native plants, they're simply drought tolerant. It doesn't mean that they are going to do everything you see in that nice glossy picture on the plant tag if you really, give them the worst possible conditions.
Good point. Also, another characteristics, the presence of fine hairs on the leaves of some plants. I think about lamb's ear in the landscape, angel wings or Artemisia, senecio, angel wings is a great example of it, or even dichondra, which has small leaves to boot along with the the softer, hairy foliage, again, an indication this plant's going to handle drought pretty well.
Well, dichondra, now there's a plant that you can't slow down. If you can slow it down, good for you, because that is usually a pretty robust plant. One I love to use in containers, but definitely can get a little bit too enthusiastic. Another great example of the hairs on the leaves is potentilla.
Oh, yeah.
You know, we talk about Happy Face potentilla from the Proven Winners Color Choice Shrubs line. And those hairs, what those do, again, they're reducing the leaf surface, but they're also trapping that water vapor. And they can kind of keep it around that leaf and reduce the need for evaporation because it's keeping that humidity up right around that leaf. Very much similar function to hairs on people.
Great point. Great point. So we throw a lot of terminology around, of course, xeriscaping or xeriscape, a term used to outline a landscaping style that employs these drought-resistant plants. But we talk about drought-resistant, drought-tolerant, drought avoidance, which doesn't mean the plant runs away, but it has developed storage capacity, like you mentioned, the succulents, to be able to handle dry periods or cactus. And then added to the mix is the phrase water wise, being more water wise in our approach to the landscape.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think it's good to understand that it is these varying degrees of what a plant can do. And I think a lot of people do overwater their plants. There certainly are plants that need an awful lot of water to do well. But on the other hand, if a plant is properly sited for its needs and for your climate, you might find that it doesn't need as much water as you might have thought. A lot of times, if we are giving a plant an excessive amount of water and it's not a pond plant and it's not a marginal plant that would be found on the edge of a pond, if we're giving it a lot of water, that could indicate that maybe our soil's not right for it or that it needs more shade in our climate. And so sometimes if you find yourself giving way too much water to a plant, it's a cue to stop and think about, is there something better that you could be doing to reduce that water need?
You know, that's a great point, Stacy. And as you mentioned that, I think about things like soil amendments. Whether or not you agree, there are soil amendments that will help. Of course, we've talked about mycorrhizae before, or expensive polymers that might not be practical, but in some situations may be practical to help add or retain some moisture to the soil. And then also humic and fulvic acids. You can purchase these in liquid. Historically, we think about healthy soils with rich organic components. But if you don't have that, possibly the addition of humic and fulvic acids, something you might want to look at, and we'll put a link there to our friends at Morgan Composting. We've talked to them before, who are very much into that sort of thing.
And a lot of the organic, especially liquid fertilizers that you buy will have humic acid added to them. So sometimes it's kind of like a 2-for-1. You don't have to go out and buy that product specifically. If you're buying that type of fertilizer, it's going to be in there.
So have that on your radar as you think about drought resistance. Okay, quick limerick for you about drought. When the ground is dry as dust, I have to readjust. I drag around the hoses to water all my roses before the blooms combust. My seedlings are going to sprout. Despite this prolonged drought, I'll do a long rain dance, and then I'll wet my plants by turning on the spout. And we're going to talk about how to turn that spout on, like I said, in segment 4 when we talk to an expert about drip irrigation. Stacy, I'm sure you have a long list of favorite plants. I'm going to quickly throw out that Nepeta, lavender, gomphrena, baptisia. We mentioned that. I love ornamental grasses for drought tolerance. And ornamental grasses have a telltale characteristic that I look for in plants, and that is a really defined midrib down the center of the leaf. And many times when you see that, you'll see that with houseplants like ficus. If it has a defined midrib down the center of the foliage is able to fold on itself and conserve moisture during periods of heat or drought. I think that's something always to look for.
All reducing that surface area. Very smart adaptation.
Yeah, it is. And of course, there's many others, again, along the lines of small foliage. When you think about diamond frost, euphorbia, Russian sage, of course, also your sedums, the Rock and Grow. Proven Winners has the Rock and Grow series, which is beautiful, blooms beautifully, does a great job. Oh, and getting back to the grasses, Stacy, I love panicums, prairie winds, Niagara Falls, any of those switch grasses also stand up to drought quite well.
Yeah, I love panicum, especially in fall. It has such a pretty, airy look. And it's always kind of amazing when a plant that's so tough has such a delicate look. You weren't expecting that. You're expecting something a little, more, harsh looking.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So beautiful. Tuscan sun, false sunflower, heliopsis. So there are a lot of plants. Guaro, we've talked about that before, and really stands up to drought conditions. Now, of course, one of the issues, Stacy, will also be the length of the drought. We've talked about cold and frost before and heat zones. Well, the length of the drought, when you're getting into 2 or 3 months, that's a game changer compared to, let's say, a 1 or 2 week drought.
For sure. Yeah, definitely.
So coming up, segment 4, drip irrigation. We're going to take away the illusion of putting together drip irrigation. But prior to that, Stacy's got a fabulous plant for us coming up in Plants on Trial here on the Gardening Simplified Show.
Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome to the Gardening Simplified Show. Welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show. I did want to add on our drought tolerance conversation before we get into today's plant on trial that one of the really important things to consider in a drought tolerant plant, and if it's actually experiencing drought, is that it might go dormant. It might go dormant early, and that doesn't mean that it died. So with your drought tolerant plants, if you're having extreme conditions, don't just say, oh man, the thing defoliated or it disappeared. A great example, I think, even though it's not exactly a drought tolerant plant, would be something like bleeding heart. Right? So bleeding heart comes out in spring, it looks amazing, and then it just goes dormant. It just doesn't want to deal with the summer heat, and that's totally normal for that plant unless it has a lot of water. So a lot of other plants are going to employ a similar strategy of just going dormant. They're just going to say, hey, it's too tough for me out here. I'm going to conserve my resources. I'm going to bed. Wake me up when conditions improve, which may not actually be until the following spring. So when you have drought-tolerant plants that are experiencing severe drought, don't be too quick to write them off. Don't be too quick to assume that they didn't make it.
I like the way you phrase that, Stacy. Employ strategy. And it causes me to think, yes, plants employ a variety of strategies to deal with drought.
Well, they do. They don't have much choice.
They don't have much choice. They can't get up and walk away.
No, they can't. So anyway, be patient with the weather as, of course, with your plant. So let's get to today's plant on trial. It is Double Take Scarlet flowering quince.
Beautiful.
Such a great plant. And I'm going to go on about the many, many ways that this is an excellent plant. But one of the things that I love the most about it is simply its color. It is a bright lipstick red quince flower. And in the spring, yellow's fabulous. It's wonderful. And pink is good. All those colors are good. But when you get that bright, searing red, there's really nothing like it. And from, in a season that's so associated with softer colors, and it's so bold. And I'm a sucker for any red flower, but I think Double Take Quince is one of my all-time favorites.
Stunning. Fantastic.
Such a great plant. But of course, as everyone knows, I always try to pick a plant on trial that ties into the theme of the show. And I did indeed do that with Double Take Scarlet and all of the Double Take Quince, because there are multiple colors available. I'll get to that later, hopefully, if I remember. And Double Take flowering quince have gotten, we've heard amazing reports all over the country, Texas, Oklahoma, of this plant blooming its brains out despite drought in those areas. Now, we're not talking like deep desert drought, but certainly Dallas, most of northern Texas, Double Take Scarlet Quince is a plant that you can put in your garden, and even when spring starts to get hot and starts to get dry, this thing will still be flowering unscathed.
So great news for our Zone 7 and warmer friends.
Yes, and great news for us too, because it is hardy to Zone 5, and it shows similar drought tolerance here. But I also picked Double Take Scarlet for today's plant on trial for another reason, and that is that next weekend is Lunar New Year, and Lunar New Year is typically associated with the color red.
Okay.
and flowering quince. Now, in Asia, they celebrate the Lunar New Year with apricots and plums, and those are beautiful plants. But the plants themselves are relatively hardy, but because they bloom so early, they're usually in bloom in February in milder climates for Lunar New Year, not well suited to a great deal of the U.S. So Asian communities in the U.S. have kind of switched over and used quince as one of the, highlights of the celebrations around Lunar New Year. And I think this plant is the perfect plant to celebrate Lunar New Year because, again, it has that beautiful bright red color. Now, if you live in zone 5, 6, 7, you're probably not going to have double take quince in bloom in your yard for Lunar New Year. But I know there are a number of cut flower growers who have picked it up from us and sell the branches for Lunar New Year.
Oh, that's great.
And it's, you know what, even if you don't get to enjoy it for Lunar New Year, you're going to enjoy it in the garden when it does bloom a little bit later in spring.
Stacy, so you're saying potentially I could force blooms on it like I would a forsythia?
Yes, you could, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that because you can, because most spring flowering shrubs you can force, which is to say, depending on how much cold they've received, because they usually need a certain number of chilling hours or cold in order for them to bloom properly. If they've experienced that, you can cut them, you can bring them indoors into a warm climate, and that branch thinks, wow, it's spring, and bursts into bloom. I mean, it takes a little more time than that, but
nice.
Now, quince, I do have to say, if you're trying to force it, by all means, I don't discourage you from trying, but it does take a little bit longer than some of the other spring flowering shrubs to force. It takes longer for the flowers to open. But if you have a quince in your yard, by all means, bring some branches in right now. See what happens. Yeah. Eventually, you'll have some great flowers. So nothing ventured, nothing gained. So in addition to its heat and drought tolerance and, of course, significance for Lunar New Year, the Double Take series of flowering quince are thornless.
That's a biggie.
That is a biggie. Now, if you've never grown quince and you're just thinking, well, sure, it's great it doesn't have thorns. It's really great it doesn't have thorns because quince thorns are large. They are unpleasant. They make it very difficult to work around the plant.
Oh, if I'm wearing shorts, my legs thank you.
They make it far less suitable as a cut flower because no one wants a branch in their house with big thorns sticking out all over. And, one of the reasons that I think quince are not very well favored, especially in more urban areas, is because of those thorns, they can function as garbage catchers. So all the paper bags, plastic bags, leaves, they can all get in the center of that plant and accumulate. And then, the thorns have stuck onto it. So imagine trying to clean it out. Yeah. So no worries about that with the Double Take series. It is completely thornless. I have never even seen a little thorny protuberance on it. Like some things they say, oh, this is thornless, but you still get some thorn-like growths on it. No thorns.
Protuberance. I'm writing that one down, Adriana.
Thorny protuberance. None of those on Double Take Scarlet. And it is also double. The flowers are double. So I think, to be fair, I do find the conventional regular quince to be absolutely gorgeous with all of that space. I've talked how much I love plants and flowers with space in them. But Double Take Scarlet with its double flowers, the blooms almost look more like a rose or a camellia than a traditional quince. So it really just has a very, very different look to it. And it's doing all of this in spite of drought. Now, of course, in the spring, if it's very hot and very dry, unusually so, the flowers will last longer. If you can give it some water, give it some mulch, but the plant will not be negatively impacted despite some drought, which I think is pretty impressive.
Oh, that's very impressive. I would consider it a workhorse in the landscape, but like you said, when they bloom, wow, it knocks your socks off.
And they bloom for a really long time. Now, they are a little bit later to bloom in spring than a lot of other flowering shrubs. So these are you're not going to get the ketchup and mustard effect of having it bloom alongside forsythia. Blooms a little bit later here
ketchup
for us.
And mustard, I like that.
Well, that's how bright the colors are. That's what I always think in my brain. That's how
Condiment gardening. A new topic for a future show.
There you go. Write that one down.
All right, I will.
So you're not going to get them blooming together, but it's just going to extend that spring show. And I think that's one of the things that's really, really nice about it. And very versatile in the landscape. So a lot of people will plant quince as a specimen, and I think it's lovely that way. It has unique foliage too. Its foliage has sort of a large leaf, and then these little smaller leaves that subtender surround the branch. So it's a very distinctive look, even when a quince isn't in bloom. You can typically recognize the plant because of its unique foliage. But I love quince as a hedge. And the Double Take series does come right now in 4 different colors. We have Double Take Orange, Double Take Peach, Double Take Scarlet, of course, today's plant on trial, and Double Take Eternal White, which is our newest one. Beautiful white flower, and that one actually reblooms into summer. So that's a longer blooming one. So you can kind of imagine these colors are very harmonious. They look really nice together. And so you could mix them up into a hedge for a multicolor hedge that would really just be like nothing else you've ever seen.
Yeah, and I love the peach. When that's in bloom in the garden center in pots, it causes people to stop in their tracks.
Oh yeah, they're gonna want to have it. And it's a very versatile plant. It can take full sun to part shade. Of course, the hotter and drier your climate, the more shade it's going to want. But full sun here in Michigan, no problem whatsoever, even into zone 6 and 7. I did want to briefly mention deer resistance, because if you look up flowering quince and deer resistance, most sources will say that flowering quince are deer resistant. Now, Double Take series, less so. So there is kind of a drawback to that thornlessness, the thorniness of those conventional varieties, I think, is what makes regular quince more deer resistant. I have grown the Double Take series. I can tell you unequivocally it is not deer resistant. I did have to take it out because they were loving life and they were loving my quince. So I unfortunately can't grow it anymore, but 4 to 5 feet tall and wide. Again, a great hedge plant, a great specimen plant, and just an all around beautiful plant to have in your garden, whether or not you are experiencing drought. So you can see all the pictures of it and all the information on our website at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, or check us out on YouTube or Instagram. We're going to take a little bit of a break. When we come back, we'll answer your gardening questions. So please stay tuned. Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show. It's mailbag time. I love to answer people's questions, especially right now. Everybody's wondering what's next, and we have some great questions this week. So what's in the mailbag?
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, Janet sends us a question that has Stacy written all over it. So I'll read the question, and then Stacy, take it away. I appreciate the clear explanation of hardiness zones you provided in your video, especially the limitations of the hardiness zone map. And by the way, you can look for that video on YouTube. Stacy put together a great video that helps explain the hardiness zone map. Yet these limitations raise a question for Janet. If the map only addresses zones where a plant can survive the average lowest temperature, why are ranges provided for plants? For example, Asiatic jasmine is identified as a plant that can survive in zones 7 through 9. Temps in zone 7 are always going to be colder on average than those in zone 9, so why not simply report that the plant can survive to zone 7? What does the upper end of the range indicate? Does it mean the plant requires a period of cold that these zones provide in winter? Wow, Janet, great question.
It's such a good question, and it hits on one of my biggest pet peeves about the hardiness zone system. So, Janet, to answer it briefly, it's that we give a range because that is unfortunately the very best tool we have at the moment for addressing a plant's heat tolerance, which makes no sense because we just laid out that the hardiness zone system is based on cold tolerance. So using it for heat tolerance is a little bit silly, but again, we no longer have a heat tolerance system. There was one that was attempted to be made, and of course there is the sunset zones, which talks a lot about that, addresses that, but it's only for California. So, what are the rest of us to do? We use the upper end of the hardiness zone to roughly indicate how much heat it can take. So basically, when we say something like in your example there, the Asiatic jasmine going up to USDA zone 9, we're saying that it will basically be able to grow in USDA zone 9 areas. That's the most heat it can tolerate. However, Here in the U.S., USDA Zone 9 can mean a lot of different things. It can mean Florida. It can mean Austin, Texas. It can mean Portland, Oregon. It can mean San Francisco. It can mean LA. And all of those are vastly, vastly different climates. So again, this is really where the system starts to fall apart, because we can talk that it can roughly take that, but take heat in those areas. But again, that's not the same amount of heat. That's not the same amount of water. So the short answer, again, Janet, is we give the range because it's the best we can. Sometimes, in some cases, when a plant does need cold, a chilling period, like lilacs, cherries, apples, so forth, that generally that will pertain to saying in Zone 9, no matter where you are, you're probably not, or Zone 10, you're not going to have enough cold hours for this plant to bloom. But, I'm waiting for someone to do something better. I would take on the task myself if I were up to it. I am not. I don't know that much about gardening in hot climates. So, yeah, the answer is that we use it because it's the best we can do for now, and it's a tool. And as I always say, it's a great reason why people should shop locally at their local independent garden center, so that they are getting advice from people who know what it's like to garden there, know what the challenges are, and are stocking plants that will actually be successful in the area.
So it's the old adage, you're in the ballpark. We're no longer in the parking lot. We're at least in the ballpark.
We're at least in the ballpark, yes.
All right.
So
I'd like to visit the concession stand right now, get a hot dog. All right. So, Stacy, question we got on YouTube. Love listening to the show as I do my garden work. I'm in Zone 9B, Northern California. My father gifted me some cannas when I moved into my property 5 years ago. I usually cut them back to the ground when we hit freezing temperatures. Since we had a mild winter, the foliage is still decorating the garden. I'd love to ask the Canna King, Rick, if he can talk about growing, pruning, and care of cannas. And for folks watching on YouTube, or for those who are listening to the radio or a podcast, you can go to the show notes at our website, gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. 2 pictures I'm posting there. One, a picture from Michio, who listens to our show weekly in Japan, in Tokyo, and of course has a very similar hardiness zone climate to our listener here on YouTube, 9B, Zone 7, 8, 9, right in that area. Sent me a picture of what the cannas look like right now in Tokyo, just kind of making it through winter before the spring season starts. And then also a picture of my cannas in storage here in Michigan. Unfortunately, I can't leave them in the ground. But if you're in Zone 7 or warmer, and certainly in Zone 9B, you should be able to leave the rhizomes in the ground, which are just a fleshy underground storage root, so to speak, and the plants will rejuvenate, especially if cut back and given plenty of sunshine. I have found that cannas do require a fair amount of fertilizer in order to be able to really get them to bloom nicely and attract the hummingbirds. So Zone 6 or warmer, maybe even Zone 7 and warmer, we're going to lift the rhizomes out of the soil in fall, allow the soil to dry off them, put them in cool storage. Cool. I keep them at around 45 degrees, right in that area over winter before I can replant them next spring. But in Zone 9B, I would say once things start to warm up a little bit and we get into the spring season, a little bit of fertilizer, you should be good to go. And if they're not looking that great, cut them back. They rejuvenate well.
Well, and cannas are definitely not drought tolerant, since that is the theme of today's show. And yeah, if they get too dry, they're not going to grow well. So I think that's another thing to consider as you move into spring. If you have cannas in the ground and you're not getting reliable spring rainfall, that you're going to want to give them that extra boost of supplemental water so that they really get a vigorous start to the season. Now, they did mention pruning cannas, and I would not normally prune cannas during the growing season. Do you think that they meant, for these times when, things start to look a little bit cruddy? Because
that's exactly it. Or late season to rejuvenate them. And of course, here in the north, we, as I said, lift or dig up these rhizomes, which gives us an opportunity to grade them. And also that digging and dividing, I think, helps rejuvenate them also. So in a warmer zone, from time to time, you may want to dig them up also and divide the rhizomes and replant to rejuvenate the growth.
And spread the love with your canna-loving friends like Rick did with Adriana and I last year. And now I think we're ready to start spreading the love ourselves, because if hers grew anything like mine, I've got way more than you gave me at the end of the season. They're like the gift that just keeps on giving. And, going back to the hardiness, when I used to live in New York City, it was very common to see cannas growing in the beds along the sidewalks where someone had probably planted them as summer color.
Okay.
But, being close to the building kind of creates a little bit of a microclimate, and they would very often survive even there. And some parts of New York City are considered like a zone 7, but zone 6. So even if you have a protected spot, and because cannas are so abundant in their growth, it might be worth experimenting this season with planting some closer to your house or in a microclimate, so that you can experiment and see if they will actually make it. There is a very good chance, and again, very low risk, because you probably, if you've grown cannas, you probably have a lot more cannas to
that's a good point. Yeah, I know. I'm giving them away to the neighbors. The mailman came by the other day. I gave him a couple of them. He's like, what is this? Do I eat this? What do I do with this? But good point, Stacy, because there is a difference between the rhizomes being in the ground or being in a container also, especially if you're in one of these marginal zones where maybe it gets a little too cold. So Zone 9B, Northern California, wonderful. I think you should have loads of fun with your cannas.
And you won't have to worry about them busting through your container like I did, and then having to destroy your whole container to get the cannas out. So that's all we have time for on the mailbag this week. If you have gardening questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Help, H-E-L-P, at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, or just visit gardeningsimplifiedonair.com and use our contact form. We're going to take a little break. When we come back, we've got a special guest for Branching News, so please stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show. It's time for branching news. Not breaking news, but branching news. We don't make this stuff up. As a matter of fact, today, excited about this. In interview with Tim DeGesst from Site One Landscape Supply. And what we're going to try to do is take the mystery, the illusion out of drip irrigation. Tim, thanks for joining us on the Gardening Simplified Show.
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here. Stacy, we get a lot of comments from people saying, I want to make watering easier. I think drip irrigation is the way to do it.
As I have said many times, watering is my least favorite garden chore. And the times that I have had a drip system in my garden, I could only describe it as pure luxury, because my plants looked amazing and I never lifted a finger.
That's a good way to put it. Pure luxury. So let's start from the top, Tim. I'm going to guess first on the agenda, we have to have a water source, right? I mean, I would think that would help.
Correct, yes. Hard to water without water, right?
So if we're looking to take care of some drip irrigation for containers, can I use a typical faucet like I would with a garden hose?
Yeah, most definitely can. So both a faucet and a garden hose is a good source of water to use. So,
do I have to worry about water pressure?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
No.
All right.
So drip systems are low pressure systems, right? So you don't have to worry about having enough pressure. But what about city water versus well? Are there any considerations there?
No, not really. They're both set up about the same pressure if you have an accurate working well. Honestly, with drip and micro irrigation, which are the two things that we're going to get into today, you don't want to have too much pressure. You want to keep your pressure low on those. So
okay.
That's the most important thing.
So we're starting with that water source. I have to figure out a way to attach it to the faucet.
Correct.
How are we going to do that, Tim?
There's a number of different ways that you can do that. I brought a couple examples with me. Is a simple hose bib to pipe thread way. You just thread that right onto your spigot or the end of your hose, and you can hook your pipe up. bad. Hook your pipe up to that. And then they also have, and there's a number of different manufacturers out there. I happen to bring a Hunter one with me. This is a timer that you can hook onto your spigot or a hose as well, I suppose. And then this one's a Bluetooth enabled, so you control it from your phone. If this is something where you just want to run your irrigation and walk away and forget about it, this is the perfect way to do it. And don't have to turn your water on or anything. So.
Today everything is Bluetooth active. I just got a new refrigerator, and it has a Bluetooth control for it. I'm like, when am I ever going to use my phone to adjust my refrigerator?
Yeah.
But, oh, well.
Yeah.
So, but that's interesting.
So it's just hook that onto your spigot, and then on the bottom you can see some threads there. You just thread onto that and run your drip from there. So
if you have the timer there, does that take care of like any pressure? It has everything kind of built into it, so you don't need an additional adapter or backflow prevention on that?
No, this is just simply a timer.
Okay.
Rainbird does make a hose spigot kit, I think they call it. And that has a small check valve as well as a filter in there and a pressure regulator in there as well. I don't have one of those with me today. I think anybody can go online and buy one of those.
Which brings up a point, Tim, and that is, you have some components to share with us here today to help take some of the mystery out, but there is, like anything else, all sorts of choice on the market, correct?
Yes, there is. I mean, I just brought a very small sampling of examples of what there is. It's almost endless these days, the number of different components that you can use. So I just kind of brought maybe some of the more common, simpler components to use.
Okay.
And no matter what brand you're using, you're going to find similar. Whatever we're learning about today is going to apply for any brand, any kind of kit that people are going to buy, no matter where, right?
Yeah.
The basics are pretty similar.
Yep. It's all the same stuff. Rainbird makes another one of these. It's very similar. It's shaped a little differently, but the hookups are all identical to it. So,
all right. So we have the connection to the faucet, and if you don't want to have to go out there all the time turning it on and off, we can get a timer. By the way, Tim, rough ballpark, timers run in what kind of range as far as cost is concerned?
This particular timer right here, I think, is about $80.
Okay.
And you can spend, $150 to $180 on a timer for faucets. Obviously, when you get into your commercial grade, multiple zones, watering your lawn and plants and everything at the same time, they get a lot more expensive than that. But
okay.
So at this price point, are you going to have a timer that's going to let you do a schedule for multiple days of the week, multiple times of the day? Because I know that was one thing that we did with my system.
Yep. So this one right here, you can do that with. And this is just a one zone timer kit. They make these up to 4 zones. So you can get 1, 2, or 4 zones. And you can schedule different days, different times, I think multiple times per day as well. So really anything you can think of, you can program with that. So
nice.
So that's the brains of the operation.
It is
correct.
the brains
that is
of
the
it.
brains, yes.
All right. So now we're going to connect to the brain.
Yes.
What are we going to do, Tim? What comes next?
So I'm going to use this as my example here. So pretend this is our timer, but you hook that onto your faucet, and then you would put on your pipe from there. It just simply just fits right on there. I'm not going to put it on all the way because once it's on, it doesn't come off. But you just put your pipe on there and you run it out to wherever you want to water. And so from here, we can go a number of different routes. You can do micro irrigation. You can do drip irrigation. With your micro irrigation, you can do multi-ports, so you can water different pots. So this is a 6-port adapter here. And what you do is you take the spaghetti tubing, we call it, and you just put it onto each different port. And out of that, you can run this spaghetti tubing. I mean, I've seen people run it 10 to 20 feet before, but you got to be careful because hose and water, your hose is like a brake, right? Water goes through it, and it kind of squeezes down on it, and you're not going to get your pressure or your water volume out at the end, depending how long you run your tube. So,
Okay.
Jeez, I'm just messing this mic up.
That's okay. But before we go down that road, Tim, let me ask a question, because I know our listeners, our viewers are probably thinking this. I know I'm thinking it. Glue.
Glue.
You put that pipe on that end, and I'm thinking, like a good plumber, I'm going to have to glue that thing. Now, I'm not good with glue. I make a mess. I tend to stick things together that aren't supposed to be stuck together. Or, like when I paint, I take the lid off the can, set it down someplace, and then invariably I step on it. Right. So, do I need to use glue?
You do not need to use glue.
Yay. Thank goodness.
Now, you can get into PVC where you do need to use glue with PVC. With our drip irrigation, these are all compression fittings, so you just put them on there and no glue is needed at all. Matter of fact, you have to cut the pipe off in order to get it off. It doesn't just pull on and off. So all of these components that I brought today, no glue is needed at all. Okay. So the only thing that I would add is on a rigid pipe like this right here is a Schedule 80 PVC riser. You would probably want to put a little Teflon tape on the end of that just to help keep that sealed. Is it necessary? No, but it might drip a little bit if you don't. So
the brown tube is extending out, and we want to either put a spaghetti strap in there or some sort of T or a saddle T or something. How do we do that? Do we poke a hole in the pipe with a screwdriver? How does that work, Tim?
Yeah, so let me just, go over the two different types of the irrigation that I brought. So the first type is your drip pipe, we call this. This has emitters in there. I'm pointing at the two emitters. You can see the small little holes in there. These put out 0.9 gallons per hour. In this particular pipe I brought, they're spaced out at 12-inch spacing. So you can go through and run this. If you've got a big planter with multiple plants and stuff, you would just run this tube on the ground next to all your plants.
Okay.
And the way that this works is it just drips out at 0.9 gallons per hour, so it's a very minimal amount of water. And at about 6 inches of depth, so you got to think below the surface of the soil, your water is going to cone out. So at 6 inches of depth, you're going to have a nice even layer of water saturating the soil for the roots. On the top of the ground, you're going to look and you'll see in between the soil is going to be dry. And that's honestly the biggest misconception with irrigation is if plants are overwatered or underwatered, they look the same. They start wilting, they'll brown out and all that stuff. Everybody's first reaction is my plant needs water, right? A lot of times, and I was a contractor for 25 plus years, 9 out of 10 times they were getting too much water, and so you just got to be very careful that you're not overwatering. And if you ever want to check to make sure, just go down 6 inches and you'll see if the soil is wet or not. So. And
then what, in terms of a drip system, what options do you have if you're overwatering? Do you just pull back on the schedule?
Yep, just water in less time, Typically on a drip with this 0.9 gallons per hour, I'd say half an hour to 45 minutes is a good time to run it. Depending on your soil again too, right? You can get into heavy clay or sand or whatever else, but that's...
And of course the weather. And the weather, when it's hotter and sunnier, you're going to need to run it more. And and then that's where the schedule, the timer comes in. You can just adjust that based on the weather.
And that's what makes the Bluetooth very handy too, right? Because you can sit in your living room chair and just adjust your watering schedule, right?
Which is great. No set it or forget it there. Yes.
Right.
We are chatting with Tim DeGesst from Site One Landscape Supply. And for folks who are listening to the podcast or listening to us on radio, thanks so much for tuning us in. We appreciate it. And you may want to venture over to YouTube so you can see Tim and the components and also the pictures that Adriana adds to the show as we go. It really, really does help. So a lot of options there, Tim.
Yeah. And so that's just the drip. And then you can get into your micro irrigation is what it's called. And this tube is essentially, it's the same as your drip tubing, only this does not have emitters in it. It's a blank tube. And from here, you can punch in. This is our own emitter. This one is 0.5 gallons per hour. I brought a handful of others. They all put out different amounts of water. I believe the black one is unrestricted flow. So however much water you can push through this, you'll get out. And what you can do is you can just plug your spaghetti tube into that, and then you can use one of these stakes right here. You just push your spaghetti tube through the stake and just put it in the ground, and it's just going to drip right there on that particular plant. So these are very handy for pots, like smaller pots, 18-inch, 12-inch, 24-inch diameter. You can put one or two of these in every pot. Where you might not have enough room to, put your drip pipe into or whatever. So I'd say the drip is for your larger areas, your larger beds. And then if you're doing individual pots and stuff, I would recommend doing your micro irrigation drip like this. We also have different sprays and bubblers. This one is a spray. And this one is adjustable all the way up to 360 degrees down to, I think, 30 degrees, I believe it is. So you just turn that top to adjust that. They also make little bubblers, I could really go on and on with the different varieties and stuff that they have for that. And then also they have extensions as well. This is just a blank tube extension. You can cut this off at different heights. And you just screw that onto the stake here, and then here's a spray here that you would just put in on the top right there. So if you need a little more height for that, or whatever you need. So
it's just amazing. There's almost unlimited flexibility now for anything you could want to do, any plant water needs, all with one system. So, you talked about the different zones, but even within a single zone, you can have some plants that are getting way more water and some plants that are getting less. Mm-hmm. And that's, that versatility is really unmatched.
Yeah. And that's, with these, different emitters with a different amount of water that they put out, that's a great point. Some plants less water, some plants more water. You can do 2 or 3 per plant. They make teas and all that stuff, so you could come off of here, and then run 2 pipes, for, 2 of your, where did I put that? But, you could do 2 different emitters off of, a single.
So it's kind of like Legos for gardening. Once you see 100%. All the different components,
yes.
You can really build out your own system for whatever you need it to be.
Yep.
That's a great analogy. It really is.
Legos is perfect.
They're even colorful and fun like right?
Legos. Yeah. So, the one thing that I would caution people to be aware of is not to use too much water, right? Through a hose bib, spigot, you're going to get about 5 to 6 gallons per minute, depending, maybe 4 in some cases. And so if you just keep adding and adding and adding, eventually you're not going to have enough water, to do that. That's where you need multiple zones. So if you got one of these with a 2-zone or a 4-zone, then you can just keep adding different zones to it. So
I'm going to back up the bus just a little bit. The main line, the brown tubing that you have there, I'm calling it a saddle tee. Maybe it's called something else. But when you put that in there, what am I punching that hole with so I don't mess this up?
This right here, this is what you're talking about. So here's a handy little tool that they make for that. Do you need a tool? No, you don't. But if you don't have really strong fingers and everything else, it's very handy. But what you do is so on these things, there's 2 different ends to it. I don't know if I can hold that so you can see it or not, but one's got like a piercing barb to it, and the other one does not have the tip on there. And so what you want to do is probably the colored side. There's a little hole in here, and you just put that in there, and then you just punch it right through into your pipe.
I could handle that, Stacey.
It's pretty simple. So there it is.
Now, what if you make a mistake? Do they have plugs?
They do make a plug for that, and I did happen to bring one here somewhere. Here it is. So there's a plug that you can just take this out and plug that into it.
So there's even some edit capability
A
if
little
you find
bit, yes.
that. I mean, not
Yes.
excessively, but
Yes. Honestly, it's a lot easier just to cut your pipe and start with a new piece of pipe. I'll say that from experience, but you can plug them if you need to. So.
Couple more practical questions, Tim, as I'm looking at this and thinking about doing this summer. The main line, as I run that out to my containers, should I sink that underground or can it just be left above ground?
Yes, definitely. You can, I mean, with your blank pipe, you can bury this as deep as you need to.
Okay.
Right? And even, or I'm sorry, that's with the emitters, but your blank line, you can bury that as deep as you need to. With your emitters, actually the best course of action is to put this on the ground and cover it with mulch or something like that, right? Mulch prevents evaporation, helps keep things moist and stuff like that. But all these components you can bury all of them. So.
Okay, and then for us folks here in the north, I mean, we have people all over the country, all over the world who listen, watch the show. Some are fortunate enough to be in warmer than zone 8 climates. Here in Michigan, where it can freeze like a brick in January. Do I have to disassemble the whole thing in fall?
No, you do not have to disassemble it.
Okay.
The best thing to do is, I mean, you're going to have water in your lines, right? Here's a cap that you would just put on the end of your main line, and all you'd have to do is just unscrew this and let the water just run right out of it.
So I used to take mine down when I had it, just, because mine was mostly for the patio and for pots. And yeah, we would just take it apart and just kind of, the tubing even kind of rolled up back to its natural, rolled form. And it was very, very easy to deal with. So yeah, we didn't have to worry about that at all. Now, how many containers, since, I think a lot of people have an in-ground irrigations conventional system that's watering their lawn. But so I think when it comes to the containers, people don't want to rely on their neighbors when they go on vacation, et cetera. That's where I think a lot of our listeners especially are looking for. So just in general, do you have any kind of guideline on how many containers you can count on like a one zone system to do? I know it'll depend on the size and the plants, but.
Yeah, many.
Oh, that's good.
Many, right? I mean, so these emitters right here, I mean, the 0.5 gallons per hour, and you have, let's just say 5 gallons per minute that you're working with, right? So, I mean, you have to do that math, right? So it's, now you're putting me on the spot to do the math
I said a rough estimate. That's cool.
But I'll say like 100 different containers.
Oh my gosh.
Or more than that. You'll never be, I mean, if somebody has that many containers, I want to see it. It's going to be pretty cool.
Wow, that's amazing. So you don't have to have a huge financial investment to easily take care of like all your container plants.
No, and I would say for a couple $200-$300 or less, you can get a long ways with this. So.
And your water savings that you're going to realize through that. I mean, aside from the time, I mean, compared to a conventional system, this uses so much less water.
It does, yes. And drip irrigation, other parts of the country, Michigan, we're an exception. We have water everywhere, right? Different parts of the country, they have water restrictions. And there's a lot of areas of the country that do require drip irrigation and that sort of thing because of the efficiency of it. You don't have evaporation, runoff, or anything like that. So
I'm getting back to that clock because I'm thinking about buying one of those, and I'm looking at and I'm thinking, okay, is there a way I can add fertilizer to this thing?
There is, but we would have to get a lot more detailed with your components and stuff like that. But fertigation is what you're referring to, fertilizing through irrigation. You need a separate pump and all that stuff to inject your fertilizer into your line.
Injection, that's the word I was trying to come up with. Yes. So I'd get some sort of injector, but your point is potentially that is available to homeowners such as myself.
It is. It definitely is.
Okay.
Now, I have a quick question on that because thinking about, how I'm going about gardening in the summer, I've got my drip irrigation, it's keeping my containers happy, but oh shoot, now I need to fertilize. Can I use this with like a V or a splitter at my hose end so I can still have one end free for the hose to fill up a bucket, watering can,
yes,
et cetera?
Definitely can, for sure. I mean, it's just 2 hose bibs, right? And you just thread that onto one hose bib, and your second hose bib is available. So now I probably, depending on how much you're irrigating, right, you may want to not turn your hose on when it's irrigating. But, if you're only doing 5, 6, 10 pots or something, you probably have enough water that you could do that as well.
And if it's only running, 30, 40 minutes or something, I'll find another time to do my fertilizing.
Yep. Yep.
And in all this talk, as far as the mechanics are concerned, I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that the drip irrigation is really beneficial to the plants. If we are keeping water off the foliage, maybe there's botrytis or other issues, potential problems. Stacy, I think it's just healthy to drip irrigate that water at the base.
Oh, yeah. Best tomatoes I ever had, best peppers. I mean, if you grow vegetables in containers, drip irrigation is going to be a total game changer for you. Yeah.
And your roses too, right?
Oh,
the biggest thing, the holes in the leaves of roses,
Well, I'm thinking cucumbers. Yeah. I deal with downy mildew, powdery mildew, and that's just ideal for it. Mm-hmm. So Tim, give us the rah-rah speech. And by the way, we are chatting with Tim DeGesst, Site One Landscape Supply, a national company, correct?
Correct.
Here in the U.S. and Canada also?
And Canada as well, yeah.
Okay. Site One Landscape Supply, Tim DeGesst. And Tim, first of all, website. What is the website for
Site One?
For Site One.
Site1.com. www.site1.com.
And that's site, S-I-T-E, like a landscaping site, because there can be a lot of different ways to go about this particular word.
Yes.
Yeah, you might get an ophthalmologist or whatever with Site One. Yeah, exactly. Yes. And I had a great question and it went right out of my head.
Well, I have a good question. So, I think that we've definitely made the case there's so many advantages, but I think a lot of people, when they start looking online or wherever for the system, they're kind of like, where do I start? Because there are a lot, and they start to say, well, this one does this many 100 feet, this one does 200 feet of tubing or whatever. What is that first step to deciding what your actual needs are going to be so you can start researching a kit or, however you're going to go about this?
Yeah, most definitely. So, again, you have to kind of almost work backwards from that scenario, right? So with your drip pipe and your emitters, you're 0.9 gallons per hour. So figure out how many feet you want to run this, right? And then, divide that by 12. And then you figure that all out, right? So
by measuring the space from your spigot, your hose bib, all around to the area that you're going to cover.
Yeah, your plants and everything else, right? And then you'll figure out how many emitters you have times 0.9 gallons per hour, convert that to gallons per minute, and then it tells you.
And is that flow rate pretty consistent across all drip and micro irrigation systems?
Yes, yes. And then, with these emitters and stuff like that, so we had mentioned you have some plants that might not need as much water as other plants. So then you would want to go through, okay, I'm going to put a 0.5 gallon per hour on this one. Maybe the next one might be 2 gallons per hour, that sort of thing. So you just got to kind of make a list of all the different emitters or the water that you're requiring, and then convert that to gallons per minute. And then, a typical hose spigot, you're going to be about 4 to 5, 6 gallons per minute.
And you can easily measure your own flow rate just with a bucket or whatever.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yep.
And Tim, we've used that brown hose throughout this segment, but if I wanted to do the Tim Allen thing, get a little more horsepower, is that why you brought the black hose?
Yeah, so this is poly pipe. It's a lot more rigid than this pipe. This stuff does kink a little, fairly easily. And so, I'm just thinking, on decks or whatever else, right? And you're going to have this running all over the place. Somebody steps on it, kicks it, whatever. It could kink easy. So then you could just do poly pipe or PVC, as you had mentioned, but then you need glue, and with poly pipe, and I don't think I've got a poly fitting here, but you would want to put, the fittings are very similar to this. However, you're going to want to put a clamp on that fitting just to help it from getting pushed off. But it's just a way to kind of keep it a little cleaner, neater, I mean, I guess that's kind of the downside without getting, I mean, you could run this under your deck boards. You could run it anywhere you want, right? You know, to get it into your flower pots or whatever, but however you want to keep it neat and clean.
Well, and that's the reason I'm asking the question, Tim, as far as horsepower is concerned, because all joking aside, a lot of people will use these components for hanging baskets. If you have numerous hanging baskets across a front porch or whatever it may be, somehow I got to get that water up there.
You do.
And I just question if I have the pressure to do it.
Yeah, and you will. You know, I mean, I don't know if I would run more than like 4 or 5 hanging baskets from the spaghetti tubing.
Okay.
But this is, you know, this stuff is a lot more flexible, and you can hide it a little easier that way, right? So you can go up a column, you know, and then run it across your overhang or whatever else. And then what you would do is you would just tee off of that, you know, into each of your flowering basket down.
Oh, so you're saying I would use that spaghetti as my main line source?
Yeah, I mean, I would come off of your controller with a larger pipe. You know, and then when you're going to go run up and say you've got 4 hanging baskets up here, right, then I would just run my spaghetti tubing up and over, and then I would tee down onto that. Okay. So now with that, you might not have as much water, and you might want to water them a little longer, you know, than half an hour, 45 minutes, just to make sure they get saturated enough, right?
Especially since most people are doing ferns.
Right.
That's where my brain immediately goes.
There you go. So once you're on the front porch and they're dripping on your head, you know they've been watered.
Yes. Well, hopefully that should not happen as much with drip as compared to, you know, watering with a hose, where you're not going to have to worry about it overflowing the top. And
right. Yeah. And if you start seeing water drip out of the bottom, then you're watering probably a little too much, right? So
no more, you know, of those icky stains from the water dripping down all summer. I'm telling you, I'm a fan. This is like getting me back in the spirit. I haven't done it since I lived in New York, but I'm raring to go now for this season.
I'm going to do it this summer, and fortunately I have Tim on my cell phone, my speed dial, for when I will run into trouble. Yes. But hopefully this has helped take some of the mystery out of drip irrigation. Certainly beneficial for the plants and beneficial for us as people.
So with the drip tube, with the emitters, the inline drip there, can you walk on that? So like say that you have it in a bed, like can it take foot traffic? You have kids, you have pets. You know, I think that's a concern for a lot of people who do want the drip in ground. Is it going to be able to take the daily abuse of the yard? Yeah,
it definitely will. You know, any kind of, like if you put mulch over top of it and stuff, it'll definitely help that out. But yeah, you can walk on this. It'll be fine. I think with this stuff, you just want to be careful that it doesn't get kinked off like that, right? You can step on it, you know, and it's not going to kink off. So
it's when you really bend it.
It's when you bend it. So a lot of people, when they're putting this onto fittings and stuff, they're pushing so hard and then it kinks over and they're like, you know, I got it on, but then I got a big kink right there type of thing, you know. So that's the important thing with this, is not to kink it off, but it can definitely handle foot traffic very well. So.
Well, I don't know about you, Stacy, but Tim's given me some confidence.
Oh, yeah. Well, I had confidence. I didn't have motivation, and now I have the motivation.
Well, we got both then. 2 birds with 1 stone. That's fantastic. Tim DeGesst, Site One Landscape Supply. Tim, thanks so much for joining us on the Gardening Simplified show. I know our listeners and our viewers are going to really appreciate this, and we have confidence and motivation to get the job done this summer. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.